As we get deeper into the Gen 3 sets, you will notice a new type of archetype arise. As decks got more and more complex, had all these moving parts, players began to realize that if you lock out your opponent from using one of those key pieces, it could potentially shut down the entire deck. So today we're going to look at one of these variations of the Lock archetype that utilized Hariyama EX, a stage 1 Pokemon with 110 HP, a locking body, a disruptive attack, and a heavy attack. Pivot Throw is a pretty solid finishing move for only 3 energy that doesn't have much of a kickback, but what I feel makes this card so deviously aggressive is that for 2 energy you're dealing 40 damage with knockoff, and you get to discard a card from your opponent's hand, taking away their card advantage. Put a pin in knockoff because it will become more relevant as we get into the supporter cards. But the point of the deck is locking your opponent, so how exactly are we locking them? Commanding Aura stops your opponent from playing any Stadium cards. So even though you're running an EX Pokemon, you don't have to worry about Desert Ruins. You can slow down some Team Aqua and Team Magma decks by taking away their hideouts. All decent enough handicaps to place on your opponent, but it's not going to shut their deck down. No, not in the same way that one particular Stadium from the Emerald set would do, which is Battle Frontier. Battle Frontier blocked the use of any Pokepowers and Pokebodies used by any colorless, dark, or steel types in play. So as early as your second turn, you can evolve up into Hariyama, drop a Battle Frontier, and your lock is in place, shutting down a lot of early game strategies that your opponent's probably going to be using to get their setup, like Quick Search Pidgeot or Wishing Star Jirachi, while also letting you get the jump on Tyranitar decks to prevent that sand damage and even the Dark Ampharos that deck likes to run. On that note, don't forget about Dark Slowking, Dark Electrode, Dark Dragonite, or even the Deoxys Rayquaza EX that did see some play. Battle Frontier just says nope to all of those synergies, and Hariyama EX is there to back it up. Meanwhile, all you have to do is utilize some different Pokepowers on Pokebodies that aren't on colorless, dark, or steel types. Like Macargo from Deoxys, its smooth over Pokepower isn't nearly as strong as Pidgeot's Quick Search, but it gets around Battle Frontier and it's still pretty solid, allowing you to search out whatever card you want from your deck once per turn and putting it on top of your deck rather than in your hand. So as long as you're using Smooth Over right before you use some draw power for the turn, you're still going to get it into your hand just with an extra step. Hidden Legends Jirachi wasn't nearly as efficient as the Wishing Star Jirachi because it has to attack in order to get anything done rather than just using a power, but that's exactly why it works well in this deck, because it's an attack, not a power. It's still able to use it around Battle Frontier. Make-A-Wish is good enough that it makes Jirachi your ideal starter for this deck. It's like having copies of Celio's Network as an attack, which means that the deck space normally used by some copies of Celio's Network can be used for some other shenanigans. Lantern was another key component of aggro decks in 2005, primarily for its ability to one-shot Blastoise EX in the late game. Hariyama Lock is a deck that doesn't mind falling behind in the early game as long as you are set up for the late game, and Lantern is a great example of that. You don't really mind sacrificing a Jirachi early game as long as you've got to utilize it a couple times to get some evolution cards into play, because at the worst you're just going to be transferring an energy from that knocked out Jirachi onto Lantern so that it can deal a massive 90 damage later on. Getting a Lantern into play as quick as possible so that energy grounding is going to go into effect and you're able to recycle energy off of your knocked out Pokemon onto Lantern meant that you had a much easier comeback mid to late game, without ever having to invest your energy per turn into it until it's ready to attack, and then you can just drop a double rainbow. Gorbis is going to be the final piece of our aggro lineup. It's just too good to pass up in a deck that's already running multi-energy and double rainbow energy in a format that's already running a ton of these rainbow energy type effects that are going to contribute to the total power of Mystic Water. Across our lineup of attackers, we're going to be able to hit for fighting weakness, lightning weakness, fire weakness, water weakness, and even normal weakness with a little bit of work. And that covers most of the meta with your alternative attackers. Of course, Hariyama EX is going to be your core. That's the Pokemon that you want in play, locking your opponent out of all of these useful abilities that they've stacked in their deck. Meanwhile, you're knocking cards out of their hand and scoring key knockouts with Pivot Throw, while they scramble to find workarounds for Battle Frontier, giving you plenty of time to set up some more Pokemon on your bench that are going to be your key attackers in the late game depending on your matchup. So if you are up against a Blastoise EX deck, you know to get those Lanturns set up. If you see Blaziken or opposing Macargos, it's time to get the Gorbis ready. While the weaknesses of the metagame are exploited, using Hariyama EX and Battle Frontier, you're going to be as aggro as possible to remove all possible solutions your opponent could have for your setup. There are so many amazing utility cards in this format, and Hariyama will punish your opponent for using them, while you use the second-rate version of all of those cards in order to defeat your opponent. Outside of your Pokemon lineup, we do have one copy of ATM Rock. It's going to be really nice just to get that one surprise kill. One more way to take advantage of just common metagame tricks like Rare Candy, though the deck doesn't really rely on ATM Rock, which is why there's only one copy. This is a teched out kind of list that I have on the screen here, so if you look at Crystal Shard, that's not really necessary unless you're playing in a metagame that is seeing Rayquazas. Crystal Shard is just a tool card that is going to turn your Pokemon into a normal type, allowing you to hit the Rayquazas for weakness. One copy of Pokemon Retriever in here to help you recycle some of those key cards, so depending on the matchup, there's really going to be one Pokemon you really want to rely on, and since there's only a couple copies of each line in this deck, you want a way to get those Pokemon back into your hand, or just shuffle back into your deck at the very least. We've also got the one copy of POW! Hand Extension. As long as you're behind in prizes, POW! Hand Extension is going to allow you to either gust an energy off of your opponent's active and choose where it goes on their bench, or it's going to allow you to gust their active Pokemon, but your opponent gets to choose what replaces it. You are almost always going to be going with the second option here. It doesn't seem that great to gust your opponent's Pokemon if they get to choose what's going into the active position, but whenever you use this card, you're already going to be down in prizes, and you probably have Hariyama EX in the active position, so no matter what your opponent is moving into the active position, unless it's a huge powered up psychic type Pokemon they had on their bench, which you wouldn't be playing this card if that were the case anyway, you're not giving your opponent an advantage, because if you have your Hariyama Lock set up, no matter what they put in the active position, it's just going to be another stall tactic for you to get your comeback set up on the bench. And to do that, you really just need this one Silver Bullet copy in the deck. In my opinion, aside from the Hariyama Battle Frontier Lock, Rocket's Admin is the most important card in this deck. And in a non-meta teched version of this deck, I would ditch the Crystal Shard to put a third copy in. It is the great equalizer of the EX era. The closer your opponent is to winning, the more disruption you're able to hit them with. Especially in this deck, because even in the mid game, say you Rocket's Admin your opponent down to 4 cards, and then you hit them with a knockoff and make them discard one of those cards at random, while they're also locked out of their utility stadiums and a lot of their deck resource Pokemon, that's some rough stuff. One copy of Strength Charm in here for those scenarios where you just need that extra little bit of damage, just that 10 more damage to get the KO. Especially when Lanturn becomes one of your key attacking Pokemon, you want to make sure you are getting that KO because you're going to have to discard all your lightning energy. Because this deck has so many stage 1 lines in it, and because your first couple of turns of setup are so important, and you need the exact Pokemon in their places, if you're going to find success with this deck, you've got to run a full play set of Swoop, Teleporter. If you're starting the game with 2 Clamperl and that's it, that's not the direction you need this deck to go for the matchup, then you're going to teleport one of those Clamperl into the discard pile and get you a Jirachi into play. If your opponent already has a powerful stadium in play and you really need to get that Hariyama Lock set up, then you are going to sacrifice a Slugma on your bench to get a Makahita down there so you can evolve it as quickly as possible. Swoop, Teleporter adds so much consistency to the deck, and since it's not a supporter, you're able to use multiple of these if you really have to get that ideal setup you need for the win. 3 copies of Steven's Advice and 4 copies of TV Reporter are going to be your draw power here. And then 3 copies of Warp Point for a little added disruption. It's also going to help you out since the Pokemon in this deck don't necessarily have the most reasonable retreat costs. There are no lightning energy in this deck, there are no fire energy in this deck, there are no water energy in this deck. So in order to attack with the respective Pokemon from each of those types, you're going to need either the Double Rainbow, which we have 4 copies of, or the 3 copies of Multi-Energy. If you're going to be relying on Lantern as one of your main late game attackers, you do have to be a little more strategic in how you're playing these rainbow style energies, because they are not going to transfer to Lantern when your active is knocked out. That's only going to be your basic energy card, so you're going to have to save some of your rainbow style cards for the late game when you actually want to attack with Lantern, because that's going to require 2 lightning energy from somewhere. Then to top it off, we have 5 copies of fighting energy for Hariyama and 3 copies of psychic energy to help power up attacks from Gorbis. When we're talking lock decks in 2005, you're almost always going to see a comparison made between Hariyama EX and Medicham EX, and discussion around which works better within the metagame. And to be short with you, I'm just going to tell you I don't think one is better than the other, and I don't think either of them is a better archetype than the other. I think it just comes down to the individual build and how well you've teched out the deck for whatever metagame you're playing in. Hariyama EX locks your opponent, so it's a one-sided lock, but it also needs Battle Frontier to really shut down your opponent and hit all of those anti-meta notes. Medicham EX doesn't have to rely on a Stadium card, or really any other card for that matter, but its Pokebody-wise aura is a complete lock for you and your opponent. You can't use Poke Powers, your opponent can't use Poke Powers. So with Medicham EX, you're going to see a completely different build where you're relying more on trainers, supporters, and Poke Bodies instead of the second-rate Poke Powers like Hariyama EX is going to rely on. And I say second-rate just as an acknowledgement that there are better versions within the format, but I don't want to downplay how good of a card Macargo can be. In certain scenarios, I do think Hariyama EX does outplay Medicham EX because it has that disruptive knockoff attack and it's more aggro. It can place more damage counters onto the field than Medicham can. Now it's time for you guys to tell me what you think of this build of Hariyama Lock and where you think it fits in the 2005 metagame. Let me know if you have any specific decks or Pokemon from this era that you'd like to see covered. And maybe leave a like or a comment while you're at it just to help out the channel. I appreciate you watching this one, and I will see you on the next one as we continue our journey into the 2005 EX era format.